Welcome to the Thrive TV Show with Lauren Parsons, helping you boost your health, energy, and productivity.
Hi there and welcome to another episode of the Thrive TV Show. I'm Lauren Parsons, your host, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Steve Hargreaves from the UK, and he's going to talk to us today about the power of compassionate leadership. So welcome, Steve.
Yeah, great to see you, Lauren. And looking at your background, you look like you've got a sunny day, whereas I've got a very bleak, wintry day in the UK here. Exactly. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, so nice to connect. Thank you for making time in your evening, my morning. So today we're going to talk about the power of compassion and enabling us to achieve, thrive, and stay well, how compassion is great for business, for culture, and your bottom line, and how when we lead with compassion, everyone benefits, and also the values, qualities, and competencies that leaders need to build and sustain a more inclusive and compassionate workplace. So amazing topics. I can't wait to chat about all this. But first, Steve, I have some this and that questions. So are you okay if I do a little quick fire round with you?
Yeah, by all means, Lauren.
Okay, so tell me, cats or dogs?
Oh, dogs.
Dogs, nice.
Oh, and chickens. Can I add chickens in there as well?
Oh, yes, dogs and chickens, nice. Spots or stripes?
Stripes.
Nice. Beach or mountaintop?
Oh, beach.
Beautiful. Taj Mahal or Eiffel Tower?
Eiffel Tower.
Okay. Snow or rain?
Snow.
Yeah, nice. Would you rather visit the aquarium or visit the zoo?
Ooh, the aquarium, I think.
Okay, nice. And a week without your phone or a week without your car?
For a week without my phone. No contest.
Okay, excellent. Well, so nice to get to know you a little more, Steve. Steve's the founder of the Compassionate Leadership Company and the author of the Compassionate Leaders Playbook. He's an experienced coach, facilitator, trainer, and speaker who's spent 20 years in leadership roles, working across a range of sectors, leading and transforming large-scale commercial, regulated healthcare and charitable services across the UK. He established the Compassionate Leadership Company in 2020 to help organisations enhance performance, engagement and wellbeing through awakening and leveraging the power of compassion. So he lives in the UK on the North Somerset coast with his family, his dog and his chickens. So thanks so much for taking the time to connect with me, Steve. Tell me about how did you get into what it is that you're doing now?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. So I started, I suppose, my career about 23 years ago as a social worker and working with initially in child protection services and older people services. I then moved into, and I began to, undertake a little bit of management. And a secondment came up for a management position, something I'd never really thought of, and that kind of sparked off my management career. And then working through public sector and adult social care, and then moving out into the charitable sector about 12 years ago as a director, found myself, as probably many people do, suddenly find themselves in leadership roles within organisations, and you can't quite believe how you got there. But my background is very much in social services, and then working in the public sector and then the charitable sector. And most recently, I spent 8 years working with St John Ambulance, which you'll probably be familiar with, as their operational director. But always being interested in leadership, what drives leadership, what effective leadership looks like, how to lead when things get tough. And compassion, I think, has always been at the centre of what I've been most interested in. And very much that sort of challenge to the compassion being soft and fluffy, that actually it's a really powerful force for good and a really powerful force in leadership. And I think probably 2 years ago, as the pandemic was really grabbing hold, like a lot of people, I think, reflecting on what we were doing and what we wanted to do next, I felt very much that it was the time to do what I'd wanted to do for some time, which was to go it alone, go freelance. It felt a bit of a brave move in the middle of a pandemic. Yes. I think my wife certainly was a bit anxious about it, but we all agreed as a family to go for it. And I set the company up a couple of years ago, primarily to do more of what I love doing, working in organisations to help leaders develop a more compassionate approach to their life and work. So that's a potted history, I think.
Fantastic. And it's just been such a pleasure to get to know you over the last 12 months, Steve. We get to
Thank
connect
you.
regularly through a thing called the Emotional Culture Club, which is founded around using this amazing tool, the Emotional Culture Deck, founded by Jeremy Dean here in New Zealand. And yeah, you are an amazing facilitator and speaker and just an inspiration. So tell us, why is compassion so important?
Well, I think my starting place for that, Lauren, is, I think, from a workplace perspective, but there's still too much suffering within the workplace. I've experienced it personally, and I look back at times in my career where I've really suffered within organisations that I've been in, or where I've observed the suffering of colleagues and employees. And I use that word deliberately because I think, the workplace can be the place that's the cause of suffering, or it can be the place where we bring our suffering to. But the organisation needs to respond, and leaders need to respond. So I think my starting point is around there's too much suffering, and compassion can be, I suppose, first aid, cure, and an antidote to that suffering. And I think in the workplace that's so important. And I suppose it's important to explore maybe the difference between sympathy, empathy, and compassion. Because often they're used interchangeably, and I think they are different. And I think, I don't know if you've ever experienced that, being on the receiving end of sympathy, Lauren, and it's well intended, but often we can feel a bit robbed, or it was a bit inadequate, or it was a bit insincere. Because with sympathy, it describes when we feel pity and sorrow for somebody else. And it's more rational and logical. And I think sometimes we feel that the person isn't really travelling the road with us. They're often in a different car or a different road, observing our suffering, albeit with a concerned expression on their face. Does that resonate with you, with you at all, that sense of sympathy?
Absolutely. And I think I've heard Brene Brown talk about that difference as well, that the sympathy is like, oh, poor you. Oh, well, I'm going to carry on with my life. Whereas empathy is like, wow, that sounds really tough, and I'm going to sit with you and I'm just going to listen. I mean, I don't know, those sort of simple examples.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think with sympathy, however well intended it is, it can drive detachment and disconnection, because, as I say, we don't really feel the person is travelling on the same road with us. But I think empathy takes it a step further again, because we're beginning to imagine and feel the distress and suffering that other person might be going through. And so we're connected to them, we're sharing that, we're maybe sharing some of our own vulnerability, but it builds connection, it builds relationships, and it deepens relationships, and it's really important. I think the thing with compassion is it takes it a step further again, and those feelings of empathy take us to the stage that we feel compelled to act, compelled to take thoughtful, meaningful action to prevent, mitigate, or alleviate the suffering that we're observing and experiencing. So I think there's a continuum of them, but I think it moves from sympathy to empathy to compassion. And the area of compassion I'm really interested in is because it compels us to act, to do something. And I think that in leadership is so important, because often as leaders, we really do need to do something. And empathy is so important, but we need to take it a step further to that compassionate response. How does that land with you, my sort of broad description there?
Yeah, it makes absolute sense to me. I'm just thinking, for those people that are listening in, perhaps leaders that are listening in, that are not sure, or that feel like, oh, how do I use that in the workplace? Perhaps leaders who just see themselves there as being someone that's got to check their staff are being productive. Can you just explain a bit more on how does empathy in the workplace and as a leader unlock so many positives?
Yeah, well, I think at the heart of how we behave, what drives our behavior, doesn't it, is, how we feel influences how we think influences how we behave. So if we are involved in an organization which requires people to ultimately deliver the objectives of the organization, then as leaders, we need to be pretty interested in how people feel, how they want to feel to be successful, how the workplace leads them to feel. So I think if we think about feelings driving thinking, driving behavior, then ultimately that drives productivity, that drives performance, that drives well-being. So leadership that is focused on relationships rather than performance, and I'm aware that could sound a bit controversial, it's not suggesting that leaders don't care about performance and don't effectively manage what needs to be managed, But I think for me, leadership that has a greater focus on relationships than it does on performance in that traditional sense is where empathy, trust, connectivity really begins to play out in leadership, because that impacts on how people feel. And we know that's absolutely fundamental to how they perform, how they achieve, and how they thrive in the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I mean, you know that I'm on the exact same page as you, that whole human-centered leadership. And I think it's a bit like chicken and egg, that sometimes as leaders, we really want our people to perform, because at the end of the day, that's what we've got to achieve in terms of business success and organizational success. But actually, when you can create an environment where people feel connected and a sense of belonging and all of those things, that's going to boost staff retention and drop staff turnover, which has huge costs, all of these positive flow-on effects. And I think it's getting that piece right in the first place, isn't it? So that flows on.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think the contemporary workplace very much is one where relationships, connectivity, well-being, and purpose, they now take centre stage, I think, very much so. And I think there's a wonderful opportunity for organisations and leaders to really seize the moment. Because I think for leadership to add real value, it needs to create the conditions within which people can flourish. And things have shifted. I think they've been shifting for some time. And I think as leaders, we don't need to panic or rip everything up that's gone before. But I think we need to be prepared to pivot and recognise, what people's relationship with the workplace is. And therefore, what's the emphasis on leadership now? What is the role and purpose of contemporary leadership? And I think it's to create an environment where people can thrive, achieve, and stay well, in order for them to do the best that they can, in order for them to deliver for the organisation over the long term. What I think I'm really keen on focusing organisations on is not leadership that burns bright, burns quickly, and burns out. This is leadership for the long term. And this is creating organisations where performance can be sustained for the long term. And I think that's where compassion can really be very powerful.
So I know that you must have done a huge body of research for your book. Can you share, I don't know if there are stats or examples or anecdotes about the effect of compassionate leadership and things like culture and bottom line and profitability?
Yeah, well, fortunately, there's a huge amount of evidence out there. We've got some wonderful organisations that have been putting that together for years. And I think it's really important that, we counter that feeling that, isn't this just soft and fluffy stuff, Steve? Isn't that soft stuff that we'll get round to when we've got the rest of the business done? We haven't got time for that soft stuff. It's fluffy. It's like, well, actually, it's really sophisticated. It's really nuanced, and it's really important. But the evidence base is really clear around that as well. That we know enhanced empathy and trust in the organisation enhances teamwork, collaboration, and productivity. It fuels well-being. It drives relationships, and that's hugely important because usually in organisations it's not about one person succeeding. It's about more. It's about teams and groups of people succeeding, and that's so much about on relationships, communication, connectivity, and that brings us back to how do people feel? What's the level of trust in the organisation? How safe do people feel to disagree, to talk about their half-baked ideas, to challenge, to share a different opinion? These things are so fundamental. And I don't know about you, Lauren, but I tend to find that I'm not hugely inclined to share my views or to challenge or to give my opinions if I don't feel safe, if I feel I'm going to be humiliated or ridiculed or dismissed in some ways. So I think, it's really clear, and there's a real link between how compassion builds stronger, positive, and more collaborative relationships, how it supports a culture of diversity and inclusion. And we know that from, the amount of researches that have been undertaken, and also to an extent, we can bring it back to ourselves. What environment am I most likely going to thrive in? Is it one where it's characterized by rudeness, incivility, a lack of respect, a lack of empathy, a lack of trust? I think it's highly unlikely any of us would say, I'm going to thrive in that environment. I'm going to do my best work, Lauren, if I feel treated in that way. So I think, there's a strong evidence base around that. But in order for people to feel that they belong, that they feel valued, that they feel included, which I think is different from fitting in. I think there's a real shift from, is it important that people feel they fit in, or important that they feel that they belong? And in order to do that, things like vulnerability, trust, the ability to be an emotional person in the workplace become really important. And we know that organizations that have embraced a more emotional culture, a more compassionate culture, a more relational based leadership approach, have environments where productivity significantly increases, where turnover goes down, where attention goes up, where engagement increases, where well-being is much greater. These are real, tangible business outcomes. This isn't soft and fluffy stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was a great study done, I think it was by Google, wasn't it, that looked at what's the key to high-performing teams.
Project Aristotle.
Number one thing that they found was high psychological safety, which is what you've been talking about, that high trust environment. And it just reminds me as well of, I love the work of Patrick Lencioni and his model, the 5 dysfunctions of a team. And he's got this pyramid, and the base of the pyramid is trust. So if we can build trust, then we can have conflict, healthy conflict, so that if I say, hey, I think we should do ABC, and Steve can say, well, actually, Lauren, I think you haven't thought about this, perhaps we should do XYZ. And as you say, if you're in an environment where you don't feel you're going to be ridiculed or have your neck cut off or be slowed in your career because you're able to speak up, you can just instantly see how that can lead to constant and never-ending innovation and better ways of working, and really working through complex challenges and coming up with creative solutions, rather than everyone going, oh, let's just do what the boss said. So I think it's very evident to you and I, but I know that we're on board with this. So for people that are listening in, can you just tell us, I wanted to look back to when you talked about suffering in the workplace. Could you just give us some examples perhaps of the sort of suffering that you've seen, and I guess the sort of suffering that you're trying to bring an end to?
Yeah. Well, let's take it at various levels. Often if I'm working with teams and they'll talk about lack of communication or lack of clarity of objectives, that leads to suffering. If I'm not clear what's expected of me in my role, in terms of, the actions that are required, the objectives that I'm looking to achieve, if I'm not clear about that, that leads me to suffer. Now, there's proportionality about what level of suffering, but I suffer, don't I, because I'm unclear. So I'm unclear, and I may not be empowered with a great deal of autonomy to feel I can do a great deal about that. So I tend to find with people that I'm working with, what they might tend to do is work longer hours, be more present, do more and more and more, in the hope that something that they're doing will hit the mark eventually, whatever that mark is, because they don't know what it is. So that can lead to real impact on people's burnout and people's well-being, and creating an environment where people are working a great deal and being very present in order to try and hit the mark, as I say. So there's something on that level, and I speak to a lot of people in organizations where that's clear. What they want is clarity, clear communication. Brené Brown talks about it, doesn't she, that clear is kind. Yes. Clear is kind. Mm-hmm. So I think that's for all of us in our life and work. But if we're thinking about leadership, a real gift that leadership can offer is about clarity, about being clear. Mm-hmm. And that's also about being clear when there's a lack of clarity. But being clear, that's a real kind action that a leader can undertake. So something along those lines. I think we mentioned psychological safety, isn't it? I think rudeness is an area I'm often doing work with people. We often talk about banter, don't we? We often talk about passion, and I find passion a very interesting word, which I can kind of get the intent around it, but passion can be used as a bit of a coverall for really unpleasant and disrespectful behaviour. So there's something about...
Can you give me an example? What do you mean by passion being a cover for disrespectful?
Yeah. Well, I don't know about you, but in my previous life, I was often involved in mediation, or often involved in disciplinary meetings, quite a lot as part of my previous role. And we'd have to, there's you and I, Lauren, for example. Maybe Lauren, you're aggrieved at my behaviour. You feel that you've been spoken badly to by me, that you've been dismissed, you've been disrespected. And I'm like, really, Lauren, I really don't know what you're talking about. I'm just really passionate about my job, my role. I really care about the organisation. I really care about our customers. I really think you need to toughen up, because, it's just not what I'm about. I think you're mistaking my passion for aggression. You may have heard that before, you may have experienced that before, whereas actually you may well be receiving that as actually really rude, really disrespectful, really dismissive behavior, which might be making you feel fearful, insecure, scared, vulnerable. And passion is an area that I think can be a bit of a coverall for lots of poor behaviour as well, although the intent behind it might fundamentally be good. But it can also be used as an excuse for poor behaviour. But it can lead people to suffer. So I think these are types of examples. And when we talk about psychological safety and trust, how do we build trust? Well, usually we build trust, don't we, by, if it's you and I, Lauren, I share a bit of myself with you, don't I? Maybe I'm prepared to be a little bit vulnerable. I take that risk, I take that step. Do I feel safe enough to do that? And hopefully you reward that with, you listen, you have empathy, you don't judge me, and I feel that's great. Maybe you'll do the same for me and our relationship deepens. Maybe I'll do that again at another stage. Our relationship deepens, trust builds. But if you reward it with ridicule and you dismiss, you don't listen to me, that may well lead to me to suffer. So I think on a very human level, and I think that's what we're talking about here. These things can impact on how we feel, and we can carry that with us, and that impacts on our relationships and how we can work.
Absolutely. Is that your dog in the background that I can hear?
No, that's not. I think that's a dog going for a walk.
Oh, okay. I was looping back to the cat dog question. I thought, I wonder.
Yeah, my dog's in the house being very quiet.
Oh, okay, nice. Steve, you said.
Does that answer the question, Lauren? Does that answer the question in terms of some examples around that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. And I always like to just dig a little bit deeper. I know you also said you're going to share with us some of the specific characteristics that great leaders share. So what are the key things that you look for in a great leader?
Yeah, I think, I feel like I'm going to plug the book now, and that's not my intention.
Tell me the 7 keys in your book.
Yeah. So this isn't a book plug, although it might be. So I mean, I've got my kind of my wheel, because we all love a model, don't we? Yeah. So for me, I've split that down into the following areas. I think these are, I suppose, the qualities, the characteristics, the values that underpin an approach that could be determined as compassion, a compassionate approach to leadership. Mm-hmm. So it starts with attention. Attention. How we choose to show up, be personal, be positive, be purposeful in our role. So attention is really something. So compassionate leaders have a real sense of personal self-awareness about them, how they respond and react to situations, and they have a depth of awareness about the impact of their actions on other people. So awareness is really key. And I call that attention, in the sense of paying attention to how you're showing up is really important, and the impact that has on you and others. So that's my first kind of broad theme. The second one is around humility. And this is really important. This is about a real sense of gratitude and a positive but modest view of ourselves. Mm-hmm. This is where we recognize the positives in our ego, but we recognize where that can take us to if it's unshackled, as it were. So humility is really key. And I'll come back to kind of what supports this, but humility is a really key characteristic as well. Fairness is really important, about being just, about being non-discriminatory, about giving people a fair crack at the whip, if you like. Fairness is really important. Respect, having regard for other people's needs, wishes and feelings. One could argue some of this is common sense, and I don't mean that in a patronizing way, but these are generally how we like to be treated to various degrees. Mm-hmm. So integrity, and that's about leaders understanding how important their personal behavior is and how that drives feelings of trust and psychological safety across colleagues and across the organization. Mm-hmm. And then we have empathy, which is obviously hugely important. That's about listening and hearing and responding and knowing when to hold the space with someone when they're going through a level of distress and suffering or misfortune. And then courage. I mean, how important is courage? Because how can we be vulnerable unless we're courageous? They're two sides of the same coin, aren't they? We can't be one without the other. Yeah. And I think compassionate leadership is really courageous leadership, because to lead with compassion, I think, is bold. I think it's brave. I think that takes real courage, because that's about doing the right thing at the right time, even when it's hard to do so. Yeah. And that's about us being comfortable with vulnerability. And then at the core of it all, the fundamental approach to compassionate leadership is self-compassion. Yeah. How on earth can we show a high level of regard to others unless we're showing ourselves the same level of regard.
Mm.
And if we're going to lead with compassion, we have to show ourselves the same level. And in practical terms, that means understanding when we might need a break, when we might need a breather. What are the things that need to nurture us to help us thrive? Because again, what we don't want is leadership that burns bright, burns quickly, and burns out. So it's so important to have sustainable leadership. And we can suffer from empathy fatigue, we can get worn out, but we have a responsibility to ourselves. So I think we take away this sense of that's selfish to its essential. Self-compassion is absolutely at the core. Let's look after ourselves before we start looking after other people.
Yeah, I love that. I always say that all leadership starts with self-leadership, doesn't it? And
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's such a great model. I really think, and as you say, some of it, I think, sounds like common sense, but as we know, often common sense isn't common practice. So being able to, like you say, pay attention to the impact that we have as leaders, that balance of the humility between being overconfident, but also, not being underconfident, not lacking confidence. It's finding that sweet spot, isn't it? I like that fairness, respect, integrity, that empathy and courage to be able to have those courageous conversations rather than just shut your door, even though, your staff member's got something going on. It's kind of, do you want to be head in the sand mentality, or do you actually want to be able to show up and address it with that person?
Yeah, that's so important. I know the work that you and I undertake around emotional culture is certainly, I've spent a lot of time in organizations we're working with teams, and people want to talk about how they feel.
Yes.
They want to talk about how they feel in the workplace, because you and I both know, we have feelings all day. Some of my feelings are kind of helpful. Some of them are a bit weird. Some of them are a bit worrying, but they're going on all day.
Yeah.
We've,
and there's that mixture of all the different feelings, and they can change from any given moment. And I think the key thing I've learned over the last 12 years is how much of an impact how you feel has on everything that you do. And if you can create the right environment, I talk about it from a gardening point of view. If as a leader, if you can cultivate the right environment, just as a master gardener cultivates the perfect environment for their crops to thrive, we need to actually think about how do we cultivate and orchestrate the right environment. And there are so many levers we can pull or things we can influence, aren't there? So.
Yeah, I love the way you've described that. And I think from a leadership perspective, this isn't about leaders becoming counselors or therapists, or, I can understand the worry that if we begin to show some of our own humanity, some of our own vulnerability, that can be a bit scary, and if we begin to create a space where we're, helping other people maybe acknowledge how they feel, that could feel scary and worrying. My encouragement is, both as a leader and now someone who goes into support organizations, is, it's going to be okay, because people are generally responsible grown-ups, and they'll appreciate the fact that they can share what they need to share, but they have a healthy respect for the workplace and the boundaries within it. But I think the point here is, emotional culture exists. What we don't want to do is suppress it, because it's there anyway. Yes. What we want to do is recognize that emotional culture and people are emotional beings, and that's okay. And that actually, if we can leverage and manage that, that's really powerful for the workplace. And it's kind of cool because people are generally going to stay well, which means they're going to be in work more, doing cool stuff at work. So, that's kind of handy.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to look at the flip side, or perhaps for someone that's listening in who may feel skeptical or think, well, this sounds like too much, Steve. I don't know if I want to open the floodgates to my emotions or my staff's emotions.
Yeah.
What would you say to that sort of response?
Well, the coach in me would say, absolutely, and we use that 1 to 10 scale, don't we? That, this isn't about if I don't know, I say to organizations, what does 10 out of 10 look like in terms of where you want to be or where you think you need to be, and where do you think you are now? And if the reality is you're at a 3, you're not going to get from a 3 to a 10 in a big stride. This is about recognizing, okay, we know what 10 looks like, but what does 3.5 look like? Mm-hmm. What does that next step? What can you do? From a leadership perspective, if we're looking at a one-to-one basis, what's a step you can take? Mm-hmm. And that might be, something really practical. It might be, well, at the beginning of team meetings, I'm just going to, rather than leap into the agenda straight off, I'm just going to give people a little bit of room, and maybe I'm just going to say, how's everybody doing today? Mm-hmm. Or whatever it is. But this isn't about suddenly taking a radical step necessarily. It's about recognizing, actually, what personal step can I take which begins to move me a little bit further down this journey. You know, if I need to express a bit of vulnerability, what type of vulnerability would I feel safe to express and when? Because we've got to take care of ourselves. We've got to respect some boundaries around ourselves and other people. So I don't think, as I say, this is panic at all. This is just about recognizing, you know, great organizations are built on great relationships. Great relationships are underpinned by trust and empathy and respect and dignity and all of that good stuff. And, you know, organizational effectiveness can be really enhanced when we put a renewed focus on that area. So let's just identify maybe some small steps we can take, and that's fine. That's fine. We don't have to panic and think that actually we're all going to become counsellors and therapists. As awesome as that isn't what's required here. That's not what's being asked of people. It's just asking leaders to think about how they connect and how they build relationships in this contemporary world of work, and recognizing that command and control maybe has a place in certain environments, but it's certainly not what people are wanting, and certainly not how they respond well. And if that's a characteristic of the organisation or the team that you're in, it is about maybe just reflecting on that and going, okay, how do we begin to shift some of that approach? Because we want people to be engaged, we want people to be included, we want people to recognise when they can share their ideas with us, when they can disagree, because that's how we're going to learn and improve and get better. In order to do that, we need trust and empathy, connectivity. So let's begin a shift, but it doesn't have to be one great stride.
Yeah, lovely. Fantastic advice. So, Steve, if people wanted to find out more about your work or how to get a hold of the book, what's the best place to do that?
Well, the book's available on Amazon in the first instance. You can get hold of me at the website, www.thecompassionateleadership.company. And I'm trying to add to the website all the time. So there's blogs on there, there's videos on there, there's links to other information. And also, if people want to connect and get involved in the compassionate leadership community, they can subscribe. And we're putting on events and sort of book clubs and also meet and greet sessions as well. And we're doing more and more of that. So I would just say, or drop me an email, but I'm sure the details will be in what you send out, Lauren. But and I'd love to see what do you think about this? You know, what's your experience of the workplace? What's your experience of compassion? How does it land with you? Let's get in contact and have a chat about that.
Fantastic. So yeah, if you're just listening into the podcast version, make sure that you tune in, check out the TV version, head to thrivetvshow.com, and you'll be able to see all of those links to get in touch with Steve down below as well. So Steve, time has just flown by and I've just gotten so much out of it. Thank you so much for your time. If we were just to close with one question, if there's one more thing you'd like to share with our listeners, what would that be?
Be less hard on yourself. I think we're all striving sometimes for perfection. And I think recognizing that we're ultimately flawed, imperfect people, generally doing our best, and that sometimes we just need to give ourselves a bit of a break can be sometimes exactly what we need to do.
Nice. And that's that centre, isn't it? That's self-compassion.
Yeah, self-compassion.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Steve. It's been great to connect.
No, great to spend time with you, and I've really enjoyed it, and I hope that's been useful to you and your watchers and listeners.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for tuning in. That's been another episode of the Thrive TV show. Go out and thrive.
Thank you for listening to the Thrive TV show with Lauren Parsons. Visit thrivetvshow.com to access the show notes and discover our fantastic bonus content. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next inspiring episode.